Welcome to the CCAT History Podcast, Episode 1, The Irish Diaspora.
In the year 1845, Ireland was facing major trouble. A new disease had emerged and was ravaging Ireland's potato crops. The already poor nation was under further stress from the damage done by this disease. Lasting until 1852, the event would later be known as the Potato Famine, caused by the disease Phytophthora infestans. The potato famine would go on to claim the lives of over 1 million people and drive the citizens of Ireland into further poverty. The condition brought about by the potato famine also caused people to leave in droves. From 1845 to 1855, around 1.5 million people fled Ireland to go to places such as America, Australia, and Britain, and a total of over 4.5 million emigrated until 1930. The first waves of immigrants traveled in cramped ships over to the foreign countries, some people spending all the money they had for a chance at a better life away from disease and poverty. Some were able to accomplish that, but others were met with a similar life as to the one they were tried so hard to escape from.
Before that, though, in the early 1800s, Ireland was facing major hardships. They were under the oppressive rule of the British Empire, which sprouted plantation systems that exploited the local labor force, and laws such as the penal laws were passed, which were aimed at suppressing and destroying Irish manufacturing and trade. Britain's rule over Ireland crippled the country and left the majority of its citizens in extreme poverty. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington at the time, even stating, "There never was a country in which poverty existed to the extent that it exists in Ireland." But around 1845, the problems Ireland was facing were about to get even worse. The Irish potato crop suddenly began dying. A large portion of their economy and the majority of the Irish people's diet was dependent on the production of potatoes. The average Irishman ate about 14 pounds of potatoes per day. Arriving in Ireland in the 1570s, potatoes were the perfect crop for the Irish people. Potatoes were easy to farm, cheap to produce, and contained all the protein and most of the vitamins needed to live. Potatoes had a large and predictable harvest, and since the majority of Ireland's population was poor, it was one of the only viable crops available to eat. When the potato famine hit, this major hit to their economy and way of life was devastating. The cause of this disaster? A water mold called Phytophthora infestans. The famine caused by this disease drove Ireland into further poverty and caused the millions of people who had barely enough money to leave the country. While this was happening, Great Britain stood by and watched, passing laws limiting the amount of support that Ireland could receive, such as the Corn Laws in the 1830s and 40s. These laws raised the price of crops like corn and all types of grain. They also restricted the imports of these goods. This was to protect the English farm owners from inexpensive foreign imports that could stand to lose them money. Farms in Ireland were not owned by the Irish people, they were owned by British people. So with the Corn Laws in place, not only could Ireland not receive support from Great Britain, but the small number of potatoes that Ireland could export could not be sold to Great Britain. This ruined the Irish economy. With almost all of Ireland's income decimated, this was the breaking point for the Irish people. In the end, the famine and the British response to it, which heightened the problem, led to over 1 million deaths and around 1.5 million immigrants to free the country. To this day, Ireland has not yet recovered from this mass exodus of the Irish people from their homeland.
Irish immigrants fleeing the country went to Britain first because that's where a large majority of the ships were. Ireland was underdeveloped at the time and had a significant lack of ports and transport vessels. However, there were plenty in Britain. A lot of poorer immigrants couldn't afford to go anywhere else, so they stayed in Britain. But those who were able to travel to other countries mostly went to America and Australia. At the time, there were paddle wheel steamboats which were able to make a journey from Britain to America in only 2 weeks. But those boats were very expensive, so most immigrants could not afford them. Instead, hundreds upon thousands of people were loaded onto cargo ships, also known as coffin ships. The conditions on these ships were very poor and had people bunched up in small, spreading disease through the whole journey. The trip to Australia in these conditions could take up to 4 months. The journey to America in these conditions could take up to 6 weeks. The foods on these journeys would be soups, breads, boiled potatoes, and other established non-perishable foods, but there was always a chance of running out. Mortality rates on the coffin ships ranged anywhere from 20% to 50%, killing so many people who had sacrificed so much for a chance at a better life.
Although Irish immigrants traveled to many other countries, the Irish experience in America is the most relevant, and it's where the Irish immigrant influence can be seen and felt the strongest, so that's what I will be discussing. Most of the Irish were coming from a rural lifestyle with no experience in the industrial society and urbanization in America. They were desperate to be able to be a part of the American prosperity they had heard of and come to the States for. They took any job that popped up and were usually paid a very small amount for their labor. They had little experience and skill and were viewed as easily replaceable, placed in dirty and dangerous jobs, such as digging trenches for sewer pipes, cleaning houses, and laying rail lines. The Irish worked for lower prices, and thus employers hired them over other workers who demanded more money. Working-class Americans saw their jobs being taken by Irish immigrants who worked for less pay, and that led to the Irish stealing American jobs notion, which heated tensions between the Americans and the newly arrived immigrants. Irish immigrants often settled in their port cities since many had no money other than what they had spent on the journey over. They took advantage of the cheapest housing areas, living in cramped spaces and subdivided homes, which were homes that had multiple families living inside them, despite only being intended for one. There were many obstacles in the immigrants' lives, not least of which was the lack of sanitation and the disease that came with it. There was no sewage system set up in the migrants' homes, and there was a considerable lack of running water. The combination of these two helped disease spread like wildfire. This didn't just hurt the Irish people physically, it hurt them socially as well. The Irish were already viewed upon warily because of their destitute state, but now with disease being prevalent in Irish homes, the notion was reinforced of Irish being dirty, unskilled, and inferior. Besides their lack of money, or the disease that ran rampant in their homes, the Irish had another thing that caused their lives to be harder: their religion. Most of the Irish immigrants were Roman Catholic, and that caused problems between them and the America's Anglo-Saxon population, whose ancestors had fled Europe specifically to escape the oppression they faced under Catholicism. And even though the feelings towards the Catholic Church had softened a little over time, America's oldest citizens could still remember when America was under British rule and Catholic effigies were burned in the streets during holidays like Guy Fawkes Day. The weariness and distaste for Irish immigrants eventually turned into full-on discrimination. Job applications which stated no Irish need apply, and illustrators who drew Irishmen as ape-like with slopping foreheads and hideous appearances. Secret anti-Catholic societies started popping up across America, which sought to return America to the quote-unquote land of liberty and Protestantism it once was. These societies eventually became a legitimate political party, known as the American or Native American Party. Not actually Native Americans, though, the term was used to symbolize their feelings of superiority since they were direct descendants of the colonist. The party was able to find great success in the East Coast cities in the 1850s, at one point in 1854, managing to capture all political seats in Massachusetts. They focused on anti-Catholic and anti-immigration values and policies, mandating the reading of the King James Bible in all public schools, disbanding Irish militias, and deporting over 300 Irish immigrants in Boston. The American Party fueled the hatred for Irish and other immigrants, and in the 1850s, countless Irish and Catholic churches were burned, and mobs in Kentucky were sent against Irish and Germans on Election Day in 1855, killing around 100 people. The hatred for the Irish wasn't universal, though. Many people in America found it troubling, including Abraham Lincoln, who noted the irony in the phrase, "all men are created equal," at a time where immigrants, and the Irish especially, were viewed. Eventually, though, as slavery became more of an issue than immigration, the American Party lost much of its support and fizzled out. Over time, the Irish eventually started to gain a substantial foothold on the social and political ladder. Being very politically active and having such large numbers meant that they had a large impact in the polls and were thus able to use that power to pass laws and elect officials that would benefit them. The Irish went on to make huge strides in politics, organize labor, music, and art. For example, Mother Jones, known at the time as the most dangerous woman in America, who spent 50 years of her life unionizing workers in various occupations all across the country. Organizing strikes in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Baltimore, she fought in Detroit for the 8-hour workday and joined in protest of the atrocious conditions mine workers faced at the time. Irish immigrants gave back an incalculable amount to a country which had shunned and discriminated against them, and their impacts can be seen today and will be around for centuries to come.
Before the potato famine, the population of Ireland was about 8.5 million, but following its events, over 20% of this number was lost to both immigration out of Ireland or to starvation and disease. For most of its history, Ireland was mainly a rural country, meaning that its economy and its people's way of life was centered around agriculture. Each family had at least 2 acres of land and could only survive off of what they grew. Because of their dependence on crops, the famine crippled Ireland's economy and way of life. This, of course, is just a brief summary of how the potato famine affected Ireland. However, the potato famine was what mainly brought about the Irish diaspora itself. After the potato famine, with 1/5 of the population either being deceased or on another continent, there was chance for economic growth. With the crisis over and food supplies becoming somewhat stable again, it was realized that there weren't as many mouths to feed. Without this burden, Ireland was able to collect itself, and as a result, the economy increased as a whole.
Diaspora, caused by the potato famine, is one of the worst humanitarian crises in European history. So what could have prevented it? Sure, the influx of Irish people was helpful to the countries that they migrated to, but the suffering endured and the lives lost surely could have been avoided. The British neglect intensified the famine's effects, and after years of intense rule over Ireland, had weakened the country as a whole, making a majority of the population dependent on one food to survive. Had Britain passed laws that relieved the Irish of their financial burdens, and if the rule had not been so constricting before the famine, then the potato famine would have not been as devastating, and over 1 million people wouldn't have had to die. There may have been no way to stop the disease from coming to Ireland, but there was most definitely a way for the effects to be minimized. The Corn Law passed by the British Parliament were out of greed and did not help the people of Ireland in any way. In fact, it worsened the problem. In all, the Irish diaspora was a huge exodus of the Irish people, which profoundly affected many countries, America especially. It was not a smooth ride, but through their conviction, the Irish were able to make a name for themselves and escape the dire situation back home.